Hello, I'm Gordon Gidlund of the San Diego Shakespeare Society. On June 12, 2022, I had the pleasure of moderating the Shakespeare Authorship Forum in person at the Coronado Public Library in Coronado, California, and via Zoom. We dealt with the age-old question of whether William Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon really wrote the plays, poems, and sonnets of the Shakespearean canon. We had three distinguished speakers: Gideon Rappaport, San Diego's preeminent Shakespeare dramaturge and author of the book Appreciating Shakespeare; Bryan H. Wildenthal, professor of law emeritus at Thomas Jefferson School of Law, and author of the book Early Shakespeare Authorship Doubts; and Cheryl Eagan-Donovan, an acclaimed documentary filmmaker who wrote, produced, and directed Nothing is Truer Than Truth, a great film that I recommend you watch, and you'll find it on Amazon Prime, Vimeo, Vudu, and iTunes. And soon it'll be on Sky TV in the UK. Now, to introduce the general audience to the authorship question, we began the forum by playing the first 20 minutes of another fine documentary, Last Will and Testament, which was co-directed by Lisa Wilson and Laura Wilson-Mathias. And that excellent film can also be viewed on Vimeo. And at the end of this recording, we will include a link to that film offering. What you're about to see picks up right after the showing of that film segment. I must warn you, though, that the quality of the recording is less than ideal. One reviewer has said it has all the production values of an FBI surveillance tape. But for the most part, I believe you will be able to follow the spirited arguments of the two sides. Who really wrote Shakespeare is an important question, and it ain't gonna go away. As will be stated during the forum, if the true biography of one of the greatest minds of Western civilization doesn't matter, then whose does? Let me end here by thanking the Coronado Public Library for all their assistance, and especially Ivy Weston, senior librarian, for her heroic efforts. Enjoy.
I hope everyone is back. I hope you enjoyed that segment of the film, Last Will and Testament. And I want to thank Lisa Wilson and Laura Wilson-Mathias for their work, for their efforts. And by the way, they're sisters who put that together. I think that's so amazing. My sister and I can't take a picture together, much less a movie. And so it's just really quite remarkable. And if you want to see more of the film, we will put the Vimeo link in the chat. So you'll see a lot more of this subject. All right, well, you've seen that little introduction. We wanted to give that to you as sort of a general introduction for those who may be not so familiar with this issue. Now, the film gave time to both sides, although it was, we have to admit, somewhat weighted more toward doubters. At this point, I do want to ask Gideon if he has a statement he'd like to make, sort of an equal time, and I'm going to give him the microphone.
Hold that. Okay, where do I stand?
You stand maybe right in front of the camera.
I could?
Maybe a little closer. Excellent.
Okay. So I want to thank Gordon Gidlund for inviting me to fill in for Richard Lederer as a defender of Shakespeare's authorship of the plays and poems written by William Shakespeare. My talk today is not studded with Shakespearean puns, as Richard's would be, but I was asked to make it spicy, so I'll do that. But it's going to have the virtue of being very short, and it will consist of the following: a frame story whose ending some of you will already know, 5 brief points to be made in this debate, the end of the frame story, and a modest plug. The frame story is The Emperor's New Clothes by Hans Christian Andersen. Some of you will remember that the emperor and his court marched naked through the city because they were so afraid of being thought unworthy their offices that they pretended to see clothing that wasn't there. And only a child amidst the crowd cried out, "But mother, the emperor has no clothes on." I'll save the ending for the ending. Here are my 5 debate points. Point 1, it doesn't matter a tinker's dam what the name was of the man who wrote the plays and poems of William Shakespeare. Whoever wrote them was the greatest poetic and dramatic genius of the English language and the modern world, and our attitude toward them ought to be bottomless gratitude to their author and the divine vision that inspired him. So all of you who want to prove that the author had a different name are wasting our time and your own, because it doesn't really matter. Point 2. Every work of art bears the stamp of the style and vision of its author. And no unprejudiced reader could mistake the plays and poems we call Shakespeare's for the work of anyone else whose writing we know. In short, as either George Lyman Kittredge or perhaps Albert H. Tolman or someone else said, if Bacon wrote Shakespeare, who wrote Bacon? Or who wrote Marlowe? Or who wrote Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford? Or who wrote Queen Elizabeth? Or who wrote whoever else it is that the loonies and bacon heads and self-styled debunkers want to champion? Point 3. Historically, the primary cause of the existence of this debate has been envy. People cannot bear it that a writer like Shakespeare should exist. His unique greatness, one of the world's great mysteries of art and one of Western civilization's greatest literary treasures, is an affront to them because they cannot explain it. This makes them feel small, and they don't like feeling small. It reminds them that they didn't create the world. So to make themselves feel big again, they engage in cutting Shakespeare down to their own size. They feel that if they can ascribe Shakespeare's work to someone else, they have explained Shakespeare. It makes them feel like his equal. Well, as the great Jordan Peterson might say, good luck with that. Point 4. Another historical cause of the existence of this debate is intellectual snobbery. Because there is no evidence that Shakespeare attended a university, some people who did attend a university assumed the man Shakespeare must have been a country bumpkin who could not have written works of such poetic and dramatic genius. They ignored one important fact and one important question of logic. The fact is that capable country bumpkins might have got a remarkably good education in the local grammar schools invented by Sir Thomas More and Erasmus of Rotterdam, like that which Shakespeare probably attended in Stratford. You can see the section of my book called Appreciating Shakespeare, and the section is called Did Shakespeare Go to School? Shakespeare probably knew more classics by heart than any of us has read in all our lives. Not to mention his having mastered the use of over 200 figures of speech before the age at which most of us entered high school. The question of logic is this: if a university education were the key to Shakespeare's greatness, what would account for there being no one else of Shakespeare's genius among the Elizabethan playwrights who did go to a university, like Greene, Marlowe, and Nash, who were at Cambridge, and Lilly, Peel, and Lodge, who were at Oxford? Point 5. A third, more modern reason for the existence of this debate is people's love of conspiracy. Would-be scholars produce mountains of elaborate and serpentine theories of codes and secret cabals to refute the hard evidence that Shakespeare's works were written by Shakespeare. Hard evidence readily available in the excellent scholarly works of Samuel Schoenbaum. That evidence includes the written testimony of men like Hemmings and Condell, John Davies of Hereford, Ben Jonson, and others, not to mention the title page of the first folio and the various quarto editions of Shakespeare's plays, from Love's Labour's Lost to Pericles. But in the face of conspiracy theories, as we know, facts dissolve. And no amount of fact-checking will cure some people of taking pleasure in constructing imaginary universes in which Shakespeare did not, but nearly every other Elizabethan poet did, write the works of Shakespeare. Now, to the end of The Emperor's New Clothes. Many people who think they know the story imagine that once the child has cried out, "But mother, the emperor has no clothes on," the naked emperor and all the courtiers rushed home to get dressed. No, sir. The end of the story is, but they walked on more proudly than before. Of course, in this time of your truth and my truth and no truth, some of you will no doubt be thinking, aha, I am the child crying out the truth, and this Dr. Rapp is walking on more proudly than before. Others will, I think more accurately, see me as the child crying out the truth, and the loonies and baconists and so-called Oxfordians and their ilk as walking on more proudly than before. Have it your way, whichever it is. Though we may not be able to say so for much longer, for now, here, it's still a free country, and you can choose to think about Shakespeare what you will. I'll end with the following image, though. Some of you will no doubt go home and curl up with your sense of knowing superiority to entertain and soothe you for the evening. I and those who agree with me will go home, ignore the pointless controversy, and curl up with the plays and poems of Shakespeare to entertain and enlighten us. You may take your pick of consolation. And now for the modest plug. I have with me a flyer describing my book called Appreciating Shakespeare. You can find the same information online at onemindgoodpress.com. The publisher's name refers to a line in Shakespeare's Cymbeline. You should do yourself a favor and buy the book and read it. Not only will it help you to be entertained and enlightened by Shakespeare, but in learning to appreciate some of the profound meaning in his plays and poems, you will be doing your part to help preserve the true Shakespeare, the one who lives in his works, for perhaps another generation or two. And you will see why the authorship question is completely irrelevant to appreciating Shakespeare. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rapp. That was exhilarating and yeasty. If I could at this point, one person who wanted to be here was Richard Lederer, who is known to people in San Diego as used to be on the co-host of the radio program All About A Way with Words, and he also is a columnist at San Diego Union Tribune, and he was International Punster of the year in 1989. He couldn't be here today. He wanted to be very earnestly, but in his place, he asked me to make a statement for him, and and I will read it off. I'm sorry I can't do his Philly accent, but I will read this off. Did Shakespeare really write Shakespeare? For centuries, a debate has raged about who really wrote the majestic plays and poems attributed to William Shakespeare, born in the English country town of Stratford upon Avon. Many authoritative voices, including Charles Dickens, Mark Twain, Henry James, Sigmund Freud, John Gielgud, Derek Jacobi, have proposed alternate candidates, among them rival playwrights Christopher Marlowe and Ben Jonson, as well as Sir Francis Bacon, Edward Davier, William Stanley, and even Queen Elizabeth I herself. How the detractors argue, could the Stratford man with a grammar school education at best have possessed the breadth of historic and linguistic knowledge reflected in the 37 plays, 154 sonnets, and 2 narrative poems? How could a country boy acquire the aristocratic sensibility to vivify the etiquette and inner workings of royal court life? And how could someone who, as far as we know, never traveled to the European continent craft such compelling storylines in Italy and other European countries? Personally, I find the arguments of the anti-Stratfordians to be elitist. I believe that genius transcends environment, and herewith offer 2 stories to prove that William Shakespeare, the Stratford man, was the author of the works attributed to him. Not long ago, the late Sir Ian Richardson, a famous Shakespearean actor, and he was if you remember the original British House of Cards, he was Francis Urquhart, a great villain, was walking along a country road in the county of Warwickshire, in which sits Stratford upon Avon. Richardson came upon a rustic father and son preparing hedges. "What are you doing with those hedges?" asked Richardson. And the father answered, "I rough hew them, and the lad here shapes their ends. Richardson immediately realized that more than 4 centuries ago, William Shakespeare must have been strolling along such a road and have met similar rustic workers who said the same thing, inspiring the playwright to pen these lines for the last act of Hamlet. Here, there's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them at how we will. On to the second story. In 1594, William Shakespeare and his colleagues formed an acting company named the Lord Chamberlain's Men. No other man of that time was a theater owner, shareholder, actor, and playwright all in one. The company's first star comedian was Will Kemp, a physical funny man who often broke into jigs on stage. In 1599, Kemp parted way with the Lord Chamberlain's Men to pursue a solo career. Kemp's replacement was Robert Armin, a very different kind of comedian. While Kemp's style was clownish, Armin's was sardonic, witty, and thoughtful. As a result of this change of personnel, we see a gradual evolution of the comic roles in the plays performed by the Lord Chamberlain's Men, including Touchstone in As You Like It, Feste in Twelfth Night, and the Gravedigger in Hamlet, all played by Robert Armin. But it wasn't until 1606 that William Shakespeare fashioned a truly defining role for Armin, the fool in King Lear. The fool is unlike any other character in the Shakespearean canon: witty, wise, lonely, angry, pathetic, and prophetic. In the past, Shakespeare had kept kings and clowns apart. In King Lear, they are intimately bound together, and the king's line, "And my poor fool is hanged," spoken near the end of the play, is one of the most heart-shattering in all of literature. In my story, it could not have been Edward de Vere, William Stanley, or any of the other anti-Stratfordian candidates walking the Warwickshire Road. Only William Shakespeare, only he could have been inspired to write those lines in Hamlet. In my second story, as playwright and part owner of the acting company, only William Shakespeare could have shaped roles in the plays to conform to the talents of the players in his company, Will Kemp and Robert Armin. The question is not how could the Shakespeare man have written the works we attribute to William Shakespeare. The question should be, how could anyone else but the Shakespeare man have written those plays and poems? So says Richard Lederer. Now, that a couple points, Richard isn't here, I will try to add on to it a little bit. Richard obviously makes this special argument based on the nature of genius. Down to this. Okay. I need a Shakespeare for this theater. But anyway, for stage. Richard makes an argument based on this special nature of genius, which we also heard in the video. You just can't quantify it. It's just there. Now, I know, Bryan, I've heard you address that question in the past. So if it's okay, I'd like to ask you to somewhat reply to that.
So let me just say, first of all, is this picking up here? Okay. Well, it is an honor to be on the panel here. I just wanted to say thank you to Gideon Rappaport, my co-panelist, Bill Glosser, and Cheryl Eagan-Donovan, who's with us here. And I've really enjoyed recently getting to know Gideon, and have in fact purchased his book and look forward to reading it. And I'm sure I will learn quite a lot about Shakespeare. So this, and quite aside from as Gordon put it, the yeasty nature of this debate, I think all of us in the San Diego Shakespeare Society do tend to like to kind of go home and watch a play on TV or read it and actually you might be surprised, Gideon, that authorship doubters, that's really what we're most fond of doing also. The issue of genius is interesting. I can't really do complete justice to it. As a comment was made in the excerpts of the film, I guess the one question that comes up is whoever wrote plays like this clearly was a literary genius. I mean, obviously you don't reach these heights of expression, of psychological insight without having a tremendous inborn talent. what authorship doubters often suggest is that genius alone cannot entirely explain the cultural context or knowledge of a writer. Ever since I started teaching, I always tend to get dry mouth as I lecture. And so what we look for and find fascinating about Shakespeare is the evidence that here you have a remarkable literary genius who is working in a cultural context and seems to be bringing to bear in the plays and poems a remarkable range of artistic, geographical, and cultural knowledge. And I believe Gideon himself, I think, mentioned in his statement the remarkable knowledge of the classics that this author had. And so that's an interesting feature. It does raise a question. You don't gain knowledge like that by being a genius. I mean, you have to have been exposed to it somewhere, and it takes time, years of investment of reading to do that. And it's a little bit difficult to see where Shakespeare of Stratford would have had the time to do that. He was a young man, he was active in business, then he's busy as an actor and a merchant in London. Where were the years where this might have taken place? And beyond that, a genius also is exposed to travel and society. So there are these indications in the works of Shakespeare that the author has a deep knowledge of the culture, geography, customs, the specific art of Northern Italy. You don't gain that by genius. So anyway, so this is some, Cheryl Eagan-Donovan, I know, has pursued this in her film, and others have looked at this. So we actually, you know, there's no disagreement among Oxfordians or I think any authorship doubters that the author was a genius, and we agree there is kind of a great mystery there. And we agree for any other candidate to be the author. The burden is also on anyone who's promoting that potential author to offer some plausible story of how that genius might have been cultivated. And Mozart was mentioned. I think maybe that's one good example to give. So Mozart, everyone agrees, was this astonishing prodigy, a musical genius. But Mozart was also marinated in a specific musical culture in Austria, in Vienna, in the late 18th century. And Mozart's father devoted years and years to training him, exposing him to music. Mozart could not have been Mozart without genius, but also Mozart could not have been Mozart without the opportunities, the education, and the cultural exposure that he had. And so that's really the only argument I think that authorship doubters make about Shakespeare is that to understand Shakespeare and put him in context, we should do what we also do when we consider Mozart. I did want to respond on Gideon's first point, which was, I thought, an interesting one. The issue doesn't matter. Does the authorship question matter? We do hear this one a lot. I'm tempted to say, first of all, given the passion and the articulation of your statement, that the question does seem to matter a lot to you. But what I find puzzling about the argument that it doesn't really matter who the author is it would seem like the brilliance and the importance of these works would heighten and not reduce our interest in the author. Leaving aside questioning the authorship, literary biography is popular because we all tend to want to know more about these remarkable men and women who wrote all these great works, whether Shakespeare's or anyone else's. I can't really improve too much on a comment that my colleague in the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship said, Catherine Children. She's an author of several books. She summed it up as best as anyone could. She said, quote, "If the true biography of one of the greatest minds of Western civilization does not matter, then whose does?" Unquote. And so for those of us who question authorship, we are just, first of all, where we come from this is we are just fascinated by who this author was. If it was Shakespeare of Stratford, fine. We want to know more about this person.
You deny that it's fine.
No.
And then you find all the reasons why it can't be Shakespeare of Stratford. So it isn't fine. What about the absence of information? If you want a literary biography of Shakespeare, which I want as much as you do, but the information isn't there, and it can't be dug up because we don't have access to it, does that mean, therefore, it couldn't have been Shakespeare? No, it just means we don't have access.
Well, I mean, I agree. It may be difficult to learn more about the author. What I meant when I said it's fine is that many of us, we're not necessarily committed as a matter of faith to Oxford or any other candidate. If the evidence ends up pointing to the traditionally credited author, we are fine with that. I'm committed to the search for truth and to evidence. And I'm just saying that if hypothetically the author is the player and this businessman from Stratford, then that doesn't reduce the fascination, the desire to know more about that person. And let me just note that many traditional Stratfordian scholars, people very much in agreement with you, Gideon, people like Sir Stanley Wells, Professor, I'm blanking on the name, Greenblatt, right? Stephen Greenblatt, they've churned out volume after volume of books exploring as best they can the limited evidence we have about Shakespeare of Stratford, attempting to produce literary biographies. And I say more power to them. The reason those books are bestsellers, the reason they're so popular is because there is, in fact, a deep hunger and a deep fascination to know more about the author, whoever that author is. And all I'm saying is that's the motivation down. However mistaken we may be, maybe we're wrong to think the author is someone else, but our motivation is this honest, passionate fascination with who could this author have been. So that's if I can continue, if I can continue it, that's the sense in which I mean it does matter to us. But
I agree that it matters. I don't agree that that's your only interest, because there are all kinds of assumptions being made before you even begin to look, because when you hit a wall of limitation of knowledge, as all of those scholars you mentioned hit, that is, they do the best they can with what we've got. But because that doesn't satisfy the desire to know everything, then people dump the Shakespeare and they go off to somebody else and go off to a lot of other people. There's no agreement among anti-Stratfordians about who wrote the plays. There's just every candidate in the book. The other thing I want to add in response to what you said about genius versus education and experience, I completely agree that genius is not enough to explain Shakespeare, but genius plus a great memory, plus a great capacity to invent, plus a reading list, plus knowledge of all kinds of people, including aristocrats in London, which we know happened because of the sonnets. I just want to read some of the things that Shakespeare would have read in school. In petty school, which is the age of 5, they would have a hornbook, catechism, and a primer. In the lower school, they learned the principles of grammar from Lilly's short introduction of grammar. They learned Latin, sentences, and maxims. They read texts of more recent Latin moral poets. They translated the Bible from Latin into Latin from English, and they learned to speak in Latin from the texts of the continental humanist writers like Erasmus. That's the lower school. That's about age 7. In up 10 to 11, they're learning rhetoric, composition, verse composition, Latin poets, moral history, Cicero's Ad Herennium, prose composition of letters, verse composition, Ovid, Virgil, Horace, Juvenal, Persius. I won't go on, but you get the point that the grammar school, standard grammar school education for excellent, capable boys in the towns where there were grammar schools was elaborate and extreme. And Shakespeare, if he had a memory, read all those things and remembered them and could use them. That's where the genius came in. But I completely agree that it's not only genius, it's also context. But you're denying the context that we know existed in those grammar schools.
If I could, one point, and ask you, Gideon, from, maybe you didn't hear it too well from the segment, Stanley Wells, a very respected scholar, at one point, this is the part that took me aback, was he said, well, he didn't necessarily have to have a great education. And he said the plays aren't all that learned, they aren't that scholarly. And now, as I said earlier, the non-Stratfordian community is not a monolith. I assume the Stratfordian community isn't a monolith. Would you accept that statement?
No, I would say that statement is too simplistic and bald. it's true that the plays are not scholarly in the sense that they are the product of footnotes in a modern library. But Shakespeare had a huge, capacious memory, and everything he read, he remembered and put to use. That's all the Bible and biblical writings, medieval tales, histories, and so on, plus all the classical works that I was listing from the grammar school. And he could weave together the commonest speech and the profoundest thing. Just take the sentence from Macbeth: the multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red. Okay, the first sentence wouldn't exist if he hadn't been a great student of Latin. He's even turning a word to a new use. But making the green one red is, simple down-home English. Now, who has the mind to combine those things? None of those 6 people I mentioned who went to Oxford and Cambridge could write like that. So who could? It takes a genius to put together all of that raw material and make it what we find. So no, the books are not, the plays and poems are not in a sense scholarly, but they are rooted in a knowledge of all those things about which modern scholars are being scholarly.
Thank you.
Perhaps we should let, since we're running late, about Cheryl.
Yes. Actually, at this point, I do. I believe Gideon, you mentioned the loony heads, or I can't remember the phrase you used.
The loonies and the bacon.
The loony and the bacon head. Yes. Okay. And that segues into this the alternative candidate. And if I just give a quick rundown, over 100 years ago, there was an English schoolmaster named J. Thomas Looney. Okay, get your giggles out. It's a funny name. It's like Gidlund or Wildenthal. But in any event, he was dissatisfied with the traditional view, and he decided to, and I stand to be corrected, but he set out essentially from the works, simply looking at the works to sort of reverse engineer an author. And who could have written these, and who could have gone about it. He went through a very detailed process. And Cheryl Eagan-Donovan, I'd like to call on you. He particularly found that with 10 of the plays in Italy, we have to look at that aspect of it. And there's Cheryl. Could you tell, Cheryl has done extensive work on this Italian connection. Could you enlighten us a little further?
Sure. Thank you so much, Gordon. And thanks again for inviting me to participate today. Very pleased to be on the panel with all of the guests. I'd like to share my screen and just go quickly over how I came to the authorship question. And that did start with Loney. So I discovered Edward Davier in a history class at Harvard University. Professor Don Ostrowski, who wrote a book in 2020 called Who Wrote That? About several... Can you hear me? About several of the authorship questions throughout history. Can you hear me, Gordon? Yes?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much. So the topic of the essay that he assigned us in this history class was to write an essay about the importance of primary, secondary, and tertiary source material as it impacts our understanding of history. And he mentioned this Shakespeare authorship question, which I had never heard of. I had been a British lit major as an undergrad and studied Shakespeare, did an independent study on Shakespeare. And I said, what authorship question? And he recommended J. Thomas Looney's book, Shakespeare Identified. So that was the beginning of my journey to making the film. And as you mentioned, what Looney did was create a profile of the author, listing the specific characteristics that he would needed to have had to have been the writer Shakespeare. And one of the first things he does is identify the writer Shakespeare as a lyric poet. And so from there, he develops the argument as follows. He looks at the evidence for Davier as a lyric poet. He looks at the early poetry of Davier, which is extant. He looked at the early poems and plays of Shakespeare, so the 2 long poems and the early plays, and then identified the parallels in both form and content. He looked also at the sonnets in terms of the themes and structure, and again, certain words, phrases, and for him, the evidence added up to Davier as Shakespeare. So for me, again, Looney's recognition of the importance of the long poems and the sonnets as the key to identifying Edward de Vere as the author was critical to my conversion, as it were. And so, one of the things that motivated me was Looney's talking about the sonnets being of special significance in that they were a vehicle for the expression of the most intimate thoughts and feelings of poets. And he noted that by far the larger and more important set, no less than 126
At home, yeah, they can hear.
out of 154, are addressed to a young man and express a tenderness which is perhaps without parallel in the recorded expressions of emotional attachment of one man to another. So that particular idea intrigued me, and I'm not, and so that his analysis of the extant poetry, his understanding of Shakespeare's conflicted feeling toward women were the critical factors that led me to research this further. De Vere's early poetry is often dismissed as juvenilia, and Shakespeare's sexuality is another one of the most controversial topics in authorship studies. So I was intrigued by that. I had written poetry myself as an undergrad, studied gender identity and themes of androgyny in the plays, in Shakespeare's work, and I frankly was convinced by Looney's argument, and that's what motivated me, to do more research. I remain convinced that de Vere's early poetry does demonstrate the development of Shakespeare's poetic voice and style. So I know that's very controversial, but that's the position that I have taken. And so I started looking around for other books on the topic. I found Joe Sobran's book, Alias Shakespeare. Sobran also makes the case for the author's sexual preference as a cause for the reinvention of Shakespeare as a commoner. So he links the publishing of the first folio in 1623 with the suppression of the sonnets. He notes that it makes no mention of Southampton, to whom all of Shakespeare's major non-dramatic poetry had been addressed. And he suggests that one aim of the folio was to portray Shakespeare as a mere untitled common player, and thereby dissociate him from Southampton and the poems written in his honor, burying any memory of the homosexual amour between Oxford and Southampton, who was still very much alive and to be reckoned with in 1623. And so Sobran argues that the folio deliberately focused entirely on the plays and reinvented Shakespeare. So I titled my essay, Nothing is Truer Than Truth, when I read in Looney's book that is the translation of de Vere's motto, Vero nihil varius, which is also a pun on the family name Vere. And as a writer, I was intrigued by this character. I did some more research. This was way back in 1997, and I found out that Mark Anderson was working on a book, a biography of de Vere, and I decided then that I would option the book to make a film. So Shakespeare by Another Name came out in 2005 to critical acclaim, became the definitive biography of de Vere. It traces the parallels between de Vere's life and the works of Shakespeare. And the Chicago Sun-Times called it a compelling argument, a fascinating subject, also, a good historical examination of the Elizabethan period from a different perspective. And as you heard in the film earlier, Sir Jacobi calls it one of the best whodunits you'll ever read. So I decided to focus in adapting the book on just 2 years in de Vere's life, 1575, 1576, when he escaped the confines of life at Elizabeth's court and traveled to Venice and throughout Italy. And I believe that this journey was the experience that transformed him into the playwright we know as Shakespeare. So my premise for the film, is that Edward de Vere, we're going to meet Edward de Vere. It's all about him. It's not about other candidates or why the guy from Stratford wasn't Shakespeare, for example. But I, as I say, found him a fascinating character who traveled on the continental circuit for 1.5 years and learned about Commedia dell'arte and collected the experience that would become known as the works of Shakespeare. So we filmed in Venice, Verona, Mantua, Padua, Brenta, going to the sites that de Vere visited in those 2 years that are also the sites of several of the plays, Merchant of Venice, Othello, Romeo and Juliet, Two Gentlemen of Verona. And the film features several scholars, actors, and directors, including Sir Derek Jacobi, Mark Rylance, Tina Packer, and Diane Paulus of the ART here in Cambridge. And one of the premises of the film is that de Vere's bisexuality is one of the reasons for the pseudonym Shakespeare. So that, too, as I said, is very controversial. What we did basically was trace Davier's grand tour. We went to Venice, which at that time was a real crossroads of culture and kind of an anything goes frontier town. He lived in the neighborhood of Santa Maria Formosa. He would have visited the ghetto, and we know that he attended the church of Santa Maria Formosa, where he would have met Gaspar Ribeiro, who shares many traits with the character of Shylock. And then he likely would have met the artist Titian in Venice. Titian's home, Ca Grande, on the northern side of the island, was a gathering spot for artists and patrons. And in his studio was the version of the painting of Venus and Adonis that Shakespeare references in his long poem with Adonis wearing a bonnet. We also went to Mantua, where Davier visited the cathedral at Santa Maria delle Grazie and saw the tomb of Castiglione, which is referenced in Winter's Tale. The statue of Hermione is compared to the work by Giulio Romano, and Giulio Romano also painted the frescoes on the walls of the Appartamento di Troia, which is referenced in Lucrece. So these are things that, Davier went to these places on this trip and saw these things at that time period and then referenced them in the plays and poems later. On the way to Padua, Davier would have passed the Villa Foscari, which is on the river Brenta leading out of Venice, exactly the same distance from Venice as Portia's home, Belmont, in Merchant of Venice. So we went there. Padua University is where Davier's tutor, Sir Thomas Smith, taught, and where Ottanello Descalcio, professor of law, provided the model for Bellario in Merchant of Venice. And Verona, the setting for both Romeo and Juliet and Two Gentlemen of Verona, has much more to interest the Shakespeare tourist than just the makeshift Juliet's balcony. There is the sycamore grove still at the Western Gate, and there is the actual St. Peter's Church from the play that you can visit. In Siena, Davier would have met the great comic playwright Piccolomini and seen the play The Deceived, which he performed, Piccolomini's company performed every year on Twelfth Night. And of course, this is a known source for Shakespeare's work, Twelfth Night. He also would have seen the famous mosaic in the cathedral in Siena, Il Duomo, the 12 Ages of Man, which is referenced in As You Like It by Shakespeare's melancholic Jaques. And in Palermo, Davier would meet the Duke of Sessa, who may have introduced Davier to Cervantes. A visitor to Palermo observed that Il Conte, that would be Oxford, challenged the entire city to a duel. So that sounds a little bit like Don Quixote. And on his way back to England, Davier's ship was attacked by pirates. He returned home to a scandal regarding his wife Anne and her daughter's paternity. He refused to see his wife and instead took up lodging at Charing Cross near London Stone. And several of his early poems, again today often dismissed as juvenilia, had just been published when he returned. And then 2 new theaters when he got back were being constructed, the Curtain and the Theater. The dramatic troupe that Davier had access to was the Children's Company of Choir Boys from St. Paul's. And on the evening of New Year's Day, 1577, so again, just after he returned to London, this troupe played The History of Error, which is thought to be an early version of the Comedies of Error. And then February 19th, at the end of the season, they did an encore performance for the Queen, The History of Titus and Giuseppus, An Ancient Story of Friendship. This, too, is well known as a source for Two Gentlemen of Verona. So my contention is he came back to London and began producing the plays and working at the Curtain, which is what I'm interested in exploring now. My film is available on Amazon Prime, and if we have time, I can show a short trailer.
Oh, actually, Cheryl, if we could, I'd like to have a little, maybe rebuttal.
Of course.
We do have 10 of the plays set in Italy, which does seem, for the fellow who is just living in England, a little curious. I mean, Gideon, would you have a view on why it just happened those plays, or?
You also have plays set in ancient Rome, and you have plays set in medieval Scotland. Nothing in those plays set in Italy could not have come to Shakespeare. Everything in those plays could have come to Shakespeare through his reading. That's what I want to say. The genius of Shakespeare could have known all the things you mentioned, Giulio Romano, and the story from Don Quixote, which went into the lost play, Cardenio, could have come to Shakespeare by reading. So there's no, it's just all a conclusion by association based on wishful thinking, but it's nothing like proof.
Would he have talked to Merchant Seaman, or how some of that could have gotten from?
He would have talked to everybody. London was a crossroads as much as Venice was. He would have talked and remembered everything he heard, or remembered stories he heard from people. But mostly he got what he got from reading, all kinds of things. The memoir of the journey to the New World and the shipwreck in the New World that stands behind the Tempest is available. You can read it and see what he read and how he put it to work. You can read the Geneva Bible and see how much of it goes into his plays. And I still don't know how Davier could have written the 10 plays written after he died. I mean,
excellent segue. We've often heard the sort of 1604 objection. 1604 is when Edward de Vere died, and yet we have plays appearing after that. That's Bryan, would you want to try and address that?
Yeah, so traditional Shakespeare scholars themselves, with the exception of The Tempest, have never claimed that we can clearly date. They say, we don't know for sure when most of the plays were written exactly. For many of them, we don't know when they were first performed even. But other than The Tempest, the traditional view placed the estimated dating of composition for all the plays in a range that did extend before 1604. And now, in the case of The Tempest in particular, I'm not an expert on that subject, but there have been a number of books about The Tempest. And as I understand it, the main argument for why The Tempest had to have been written after 1604 was that it was based upon the so-called Strachey letter, which was a letter describing a shipwreck in the New World. It turns out that letter itself was largely based upon, and they have plagiarized a much earlier report. And so that the origins of that description or that source, in fact, predate 1604. And furthermore, the specific form of that account that dated from 1610 would not have been easily available to Shakespeare of Stratford anyway. And so this has been explored. There's a book on the dating sources of The Tempest, published by two authors, Stripmatter and Kozycki, which has been a well-reviewed book, including by Orthodox mainstream scholars. And the evidence discussed in that book suggests that there is, in fact, while it doesn't necessarily indicate exactly when The Tempest was written, there is no clear evidence it was written after 1604. So in sum, there isn't actually any solid evidence that any of the plays necessarily date after 1604. It is interesting that when you look at the publications of Shakespearean works, there's a sharp drop-off, a huge flood of plays published and credited to William Shakespeare between 1598, when they first started bearing the name of Shakespeare, up to 1604. And then it kind of drops off a cliff, and there's a marked drop-off. There are a few plays that are published after that with Shakespeare's name. For the most part, the main publication that comes after 1604 is in the First Folio, which is, of course, well after Edward de Vere died, but also 7 years after Shakespeare of Stratford died. So ironically, both authors, both the traditionally credited author and Edward de Vere, are in a situation where half of the Shakespeare canon is first published many years after either of them died. So they both have the situation of posthumous publication. But in both cases, plays could be written a long time before they were published. So there's a lot more to say about the 1604 question. The flip side, as Oxfordians see it, is there are also a lot of 1616 questions. So if there's a 1604 question about Shakespeare of Stratford, which is fair to say, we don't deny there's a lot of questions, there are some 1616 questions about about Oxford. There is a 1616 question about Shakespeare of Stratford. That is indications that the author may have died many years before that, which makes it difficult to fit the chronology with Shakespeare of Stratford. I shouldn't consume more time now. There's a lot to cover and other people want to talk.
So Cheryl raised her hand. She wanted to ask a question.
Yes, response from Cheryl.
Oh, thank you so much. Actually, I just wanted to touch on 2 points. One would be, seeing the artwork in Venice at the time, I think is significant. And I don't think, Giulio Romano, it's often dismissed as a mistake that Shakespeare made, calling him a great sculptor in Winter's Tale. But in fact, he was known as a sculptor. And so the person from Stratford could not have seen that statue at the cathedral in Mantua and could not have seen the frescoes on the walls depicting the Trojan War at the Appartamento di Troia. So he would have to had, as you said, Gideon, have someone else have seen it and told him about it in great, great detail. 242 lines in Lucrece describing that fresco. So that's one point I wanted to make. And the other was just, you mentioned the Bible, the Geneva Bible. So the Geneva Bible, owned by Edward Davier, is at the Folger Library in Washington, D.C. And it is perhaps the strongest piece of direct evidence we have of Shakespeare's relationship to Edward de Vere, in that, it is extensively annotated, and the annotations do match up with several passages in the plays and poems, and, PhD study was done by Roger Strittmatter on that. So the Bible, I've had a chance to see it. It's very significant. It's one of the most significant pieces of evidence we have. Thank you.
If I could turn back to one other issue, Gideon brought this up, and it was brought up by Jonathan Bate in the video. Well, these are you're conspiracy theorists. That's your problem. And but in some, Bryan, wouldn't the non-Stratfordian side would say, well, even paranoids have enemies, I suppose, or you would have to say it is a conspiracy, and I think Cheryl referred to it too, as well as Southampton's influence even into 1623. There's a question, I think about this too, where I can see, okay, he was a nobleman. It would be embarrassing for him to publish these plays or whatever in his, certainly during his lifetime, but then after he died, and certainly by the time of the first folio, long after he died, how do you state the usual non-Stratfordian case or Oxfordian case for the secrecy?
Yeah, the question of, I guess, conspiracy is an interesting one, and I think some people, are drawn to conspiracy theories. So, authorship doubters are a vast and diverse group, and I think we're generally fascinated by history. It's worth noting that conspiracies do happen in the real world, and so although it's definitely possible to go overboard with conspiracy theories, anonymous writings, pseudonyms, people writing under an assumed name is something that happened in the Elizabethan age. It happens today. And there could be good reasons for that. When the first folio is published, as I think the Lisa Wilson's film was pointing out, that wasn't many, many years after all the interested people were dead. Edward de Vere was dead by that time, but Southampton, the Earl of Southampton, to whom there were these rather florid published dedications, Venus and Adonis, Rape of Lucrece, and even Orthodox scholars have agreed for many years that it appears the beloved youth in the sonnets is quite likely, if not Southampton, then another young nobleman, William Herbert. Those are the two main candidates. Orthodox scholars have said for who the beloved youth is, they're alive and well. They're very powerful noblemen. And it would have been possibly not viewed as acceptable to openly publish or start openly talking about who the real author was. And their families are still powerful, still living for years after that. So that could explain, in theory, why a pseudonym might have been originally adopted and might have been maintained. But I think any honest authorship skeptic would agree there's a lot of mysteries that we don't know the answer to here. We don't pretend to have all the answers. We simply find the subject fascinating. Now, the conspiracy, it ties into the broader thing, I guess, is the motivation. And I certainly have no pretensions, no illusion that I'm going to persuade Gideon or many people in the audience in this event to adopt authorship skepticism or to suddenly switch from the traditional view to an alternative authorship theory. My only hope, a more modest hope I would have, I think, would be maybe to persuade Gideon and others that our motivation as doubters really is not that we're just fascinated by conspiracy. It's not that we're snobs or elitists. We really honestly do find the evidence to raise questions. That we may be mistaken, people can be mistaken in how they read evidence, but our motivation, quite honestly, is what we see as a fascinating range of evidence. We see evidence linking the works to some of all the alternative authors, notably Edward de Vere. Although there have been a lot of alternative authors suggested, it's fair to say that the predominant alternative author by a couple of country miles is Edward de Vere. So you can't equate all alternative authorship theories, but there are others. We see problems in the evidence for the traditional view with the chronology, with the questions that Cheryl mentioned, like it's difficult to explain how you could write about some of these areas without having visited. The other question motivation is on the elitism motivation. I would just say one of the alternative candidates, which Richard Lederer mentioned, is Christopher Marlowe. It's logically not possible for a Marlowean authorship advocate to be a snob. It's not possible. Christopher Marlowe came from a much more modest background, socioeconomically lower background than Shakespeare of Stratford. So while it's true that Edward de Vere was an aristocrat, our Marlowean friends, whatever motivates them, it's not snobbery. And so they recognize, and we all recognize, that great writers could come from modest social backgrounds. We just have a disagreement about who this particular writer of these particular works was. And I don't think it was Marlowe, but that's a complicated question. Can't do justice to that. Perhaps should have an advocate of the Marlowe theory at some point if they want to present that. But whatever else you can say about Marlowe, you can't be a snob and advocate Marlowe. He got to university only by scholarship. And by the way, that is interesting evidence. So if Shakespeare Stratford did somehow acquire this knowledge and learning, one would think there might be some evidence of it. We do have evidence that Marlowe got a scholarship, went to university, did these other things. Of course, he was not, I agree with Gideon, he's not as great a writer as Shakespeare, but he's not chopped liver. I mean, he was still one of the second-rank Elizabethan playwrights. And
different writer from Shakespeare.
Oh, I agree. I personally agree with that. I think there's quite a distinct difference. So this is one area where among Shakespeare authorship doubters, there's a huge and diverse range of disagreement. Believe me, the debates between the traditional view and the doubters are equal in vigor to the debates between the Marlovians and the Baconians and the Oxfordians. So obviously we can't all be right, but we think we have some pieces of the puzzle and we think we might be right about some parts, and we think that traditional scholars may be wrong about some pieces of the puzzle. One thing I pointed out, a lesson that I learned in writing my book, and this will be my final comment here, and I hope we can continue on, is that all sides in this debate, both Stratfordians, those of us who question and criticize the theory, we all need to do a better job of reading each other's scholarly work more carefully and respectfully to advance the search for truth, not to score points. And I will say, J. Thomas Looney, he did have a funny name. I've never thought of it as the strongest type of argument to make fun of someone's name. So
I can only make fun of his name because I think his argument's absurd. But I'm glad to hear you say that clarify motivations. That's very good to hear. And I'm glad that we're both interested in pursuit of truth. There is one bit of evidence that Cheryl gave us that I want to undermine a little, and that's the whole bisexuality argument. I do not believe that Shakespeare was bisexual. I think he was capable of a romantic attachment to the young man of the sonnets, but I think Sonnet 20 proves that it was not. homosexual. It was an imaginative joke. And the more evidence is that the sexually explicit sonnets are all to the lady, and the sonnets to the man are all much more idealizing. So I don't think there could be any justification in the works of Shakespeare for saying that the plays had, the author of the plays had to be suppressed because it would have been embarrassing. The sexuality question would have been embarrassing for an aristocrat. I think it would have been actually less embarrassing for an aristocrat than for a country bumpkin. But in any case, I think it's irrelevant because I can prove from the plays themselves that Shakespeare was probably not homosexual. So that's just to undermine one particular small point that was made.
Okay, well, we're getting to the end of our time. But I wonder if I could just bring up one point, going back to something Jonathan Bate was saying. You can't argue with these historical facts, and it's dangerous. You have a dangerous law professor, dangerous English teacher here. And so, but one thing, if I could ask you, Gideon, for your view, we know 1593, publication of Venus and Adonis, the name Shakespeare. 1594, the Rape of Lucrece, the name Shakespeare. Now, I've read, and this is from Bryan's book, I've read this explanations timeline. After that, many of the plays were published anonymously. And the question, well, wouldn't a scrappy, up-and-coming Horatio Alger type fellow from the sticks want to have more publicity? Why do you have any view on why those plays were published anonymously?
First of all, Shakespeare was not a modern 21st century publicity hound. He was a very, very successful playwright and very popular, so much so that there are hundreds of poems and many plays that claim to be by William Shakespeare that are not by William Shakespeare. There was a whole industry, a whole cottage industry among publishers trying to get people to believe that Shakespeare had a hand in whatever they were publishing because it meant the sales would be up. So often the plays were published without authorship stated, that's true, but the evidence of the first folio and the testimony of the people quoted in it is so overwhelmingly strong that, and above all that, the voice of Shakespeare is a unique voice. There is nobody else in the time that you can read that sounds like Shakespeare. And anything you read that is traditionally known to be by Shakespeare sounds like Shakespeare. So I don't know how you can get past that hurdle unless you say there was no Shakespeare, everything by Shakespeare was by Edward de Vere, and everything by Edward de Vere that we know to be by Edward de Vere was not. It was by someone else pretending to be Edward de Vere because the voices are not the same voice. To me, that's the slam dunk case.
I'm glad we can end on a note of agreement because I think agree, and many Oxfordians would agree that the voice of the author Shakespeare is very distinctive and very recognizable. So yeah, I think that's a point of consensus. I also suggest, Gideon, that you are familiar with the poetic works of Edward de Vere.
I have not many are, but not done a study.
Yeah, I'm pleased that someone pays attention to them. There aren't many. It is thought that they were mostly early poems, juvenilia. So scholars of Walt Whitman have looked at Whitman's early poetry and have said, I just from a book I read about Whitman, that it's unrecognizable. It bears no resemblance to the leaves of grass and the later poetry. So that does raise an issue whether the poetic voice could change. But anyway, your basic point, I think, is sound. And I agree with that when we look at things that were published at the time, certainly of the mature Shakespeare, the voice does come through. And why things were anonymous or had the author's name on it. There were a lot of authors back then. Plays may not have been viewed as meriting publication with an author's name, so that's an issue too. I mean, I think it is part of the mystery, but it's certainly not. That's not a powerful basis on which I would say it had to be someone else. The plays were published anonymously. You might also be surprised that many Oxfordians agree with you that Shakespeare, the sonnets, are not indicating a sexual interest in the beloved youth. It's a complicated subject. Some do think there's a sexual element. But that very same debate happens again among Oxfordians as among traditionalists. Was he bisexual, or was he? My own view is that he was predominantly heterosexual, but there may be some indications in plays and poetry of bisexuality. I would not hazard a view about the sonnets. That's an area where I would hazard to tread because I haven't studied it enough.
Well, I'm going to go with that. I think we have some, despite our technical hiccups, it's nice we didn't have fisticuffs or anything, I have to call it security. So I think, well, I know there are a lot more questions out there, a lot more concerns, or a lot more interest, but I think we're going to cut it off there. And like I said, you heard the films and so forth. And I so much want to thank our knowledgeable people, on Zoom. Yeah, they're shaking hands. See, it worked out. So anyway, from the San Diego Shakespeare Society, I just want to thank again the Cornell Library for this forum, and adieu. Well, I hope you enjoyed the Shakespeare Authorship Forum. And now, as promised, I will share with you, I will display a description of the Vimeo on-demand link to Last Will and Testament. As I mentioned, that's the film segment of that we did show during the forum to try and give an introduction to the whole authorship question to someone who's maybe not so familiar with it, all of the ins and outs. One update too, by the way, to the forum. I know it looked like it all ended quite amiably and finding common ground and all that. But actually, there was a fight did break out, and after when the camera stopped rolling, and it was really a Donnybrook, we had to call the cops and everything. So, but that's strong emotions are engendered by this whole question. So, that's all for the Shakespeare Authorship Forum. Adieu.